It begins not with rockets, not with walls, and not with treaties or negotiations. It begins with memory. The kind of memory that spans generations, carved into land and bone, etched in the silence between checkpoints, in the whispers of grandparents who fled, who fought, who never returned. To understand why a child in Gaza grows up beneath drones and sirens, or why a teenager in Tel Aviv hears alarms in the night and races for shelter, we must trace the echo that has never faded. The echo of promises made, broken, denied, and rewritten by empires, leaders, and ordinary people caught in the storm of history. Long before Gaza was a strip choked by blockade, or before Jerusalem became the center of global contention, there was a time when Palestine existed as part of something else. Part of the Ottoman Empire, a sprawling, centuries-old dominion ruled from Istanbul. For hundreds of years, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived on the land together, often in tension but often in peace. The people of this land lived under a system where religion mattered, but not always in the way it would later. Identities were layered. A merchant in Jaffa might be Arab, Ottoman, and Muslim, but also neighbor to a Christian family and employer of a Jewish craftsman. This was not paradise, but nor was it a war zone. Not yet. But empires do not last forever. When World War I tore Europe and the Middle East apart, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and with it came a power vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped a new empire, the British. With soldiers and maps, and a colonial ambition sharpened by war, Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. It was 1917, and the world was changing. It was also the year of a single-page letter that would change everything, the Balfour Declaration. In this letter, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour declared his government's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also asserting that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. It was, as history would show, a contradiction, a tightrope, a document that promised two irreconcilable futures. To Jewish people across Europe, facing rising anti-Semitism, pogroms, and later genocide, the Balfour Declaration was a promise of sanctuary. The Zionist movement, which had taken root decades earlier with the dream of re-establishing a Jewish homeland, now had powerful imperial backing. Jewish immigration to Palestine began to rise, slowly at first, then rapidly. In 1918, Jews made up less than 10% of the population of Palestine. By the 1930s, that number had tripled. To the Arab population, Christian and Muslim alike, this was not a dream. It was the beginning of an erasure. The local Palestinian Arabs, who had lived on the land for generations, saw the influx of immigrants and land purchases as a threat to their way of life, their economy, their political future. Tensions boiled over into riots in 1920, 1929, and 1936, each more violent than the last. The British, caught in their own imperial contradiction, tried to mediate but only deepened the divide. They issued white papers, commissions, and promises, always too late, too weak, and too conflicting. The world around them was falling apart. In Europe, Hitler had risen to power. The Holocaust was beginning. And as Jews faced genocide in Nazi camps, more and more fled to what they believed was the only land that could be theirs. After the war, the numbers were undeniable. The displaced, the orphaned, the survivors had nowhere else to go. But the British, fearing further unrest, tried to limit immigration. And so the stage was set for violence not just between Arabs and Jews, but between Jewish militias and British authorities. Attacks against British soldiers, bombings of infrastructure, assassinations, all became part of a desperate campaign to force Britain out and open the doors of Palestine. By 1947, the British had had enough. Bankrupted and battered by World War II, they handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed a partition to divide Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. The Jews accepted the plan. The Arabs rejected it. They saw it as a theft. How could over half the land be given to a population that, even after waves of immigration, still made up less than a third of the inhabitants? On May 14, 1948, the British mandate officially ended. David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. Jubilation erupted among Jews, both in Palestine and across the world. But for Palestinians, this date marks something else entirely: the Nakba, or catastrophe. As Israel was born, Arab armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded. What followed was the First Arab-Israeli War. Israel survived. In fact, it gained even more territory than the original UN plan had allotted. But the human cost was staggering. Over 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes, often by force, sometimes by fear, and occasionally by choice. Though in war, choice is often an illusion. Villages were emptied, towns depopulated. Hundreds of Palestinian communities were destroyed or abandoned. Families were scattered into Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. Their homes, lands, and keys became symbols of a lost homeland, a wound that never healed. Meanwhile, inside the new state of Israel, a new society took shape. Holocaust survivors arrived in large numbers, alongside Jews from Iraq, Morocco, Yemen, and Eastern Europe. The state was building fast, its economy growing, its military sharpening, but it was also hardening. Building walls, both literal and psychological, around a national identity forged in trauma and surrounded by enemies. Palestinians who remained in the new state became second-class citizens. Those who fled became stateless refugees. And those in the West Bank and Gaza, now under Jordanian and Egyptian control respectively, lived under different flags but with the same sense of loss. The lines were drawn, but they would not hold. Over the next decades, war would return again and again. In 1956, in 1967, in 1973. Each time, the map of the region shifted, but the core conflict remained. Two peoples, one land, two narratives that could not be reconciled. And beneath every truce, every ceasefire, every broken peace accord, the memory endured. Of olive trees left behind, of homes razed, of ancestors buried in soil they could no longer visit. And Gaza would become something else entirely. But we'll get to that. Because the story doesn't end here. In fact, it doesn't even begin to unravel yet. It's only just begun. Here is on part 2 of your long-form documentary script. Why are Israel and Palestine still at war? The conflict. 100 years in the making, part 2. If 1948 was the birth of Israel and the scattering of the Palestinians, then 1967 was the year the map was rewritten in bold, aggressive strokes. And with it, the foundations of the modern Israeli-Palestinian crisis were cemented. It was called the Six-Day War, but its consequences would last decades. In less than a week, Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a geographic transformation. In 6 days, Israel seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And suddenly, with one stroke of war, Israel became an occupying power. More than 1 million Palestinians were now living under Israeli military rule. The West Bank and Gaza were no longer under Arab administration. They were territories caught in a limbo between military control and political uncertainty. Israel argued that it had to hold these lands for security reasons, surrounded as it was by hostile neighbors. But the occupation quickly evolved into something more. Settlements, small at first, then growing rapidly, began to dot the hills of the West Bank. These were Jewish communities, built on land Palestinians considered theirs, protected by the Israeli army, connected by Israeli-only roads. Officially, they were temporary. In practice, they were permanent. And they kept growing. Every house built, every road paved, was another assertion that Israel was not just defending itself, it was redefining borders. In Gaza, meanwhile, the reality was harsher still. Densely populated, impoverished, and cut off from the outside world, Gaza became a pressure cooker. The frustration of a generation grew under the weight of checkpoints, curfews, and humiliation. The spark came in 1987, when a group of Palestinians in Gaza were killed in a traffic accident involving an Israeli military vehicle. It was likely unintentional, but the rage it triggered was anything but. The First Intifada, Arabic for uprising, erupted across the West Bank and Gaza. For 5 years, Palestinians, many of them teenagers, took to the streets in protests, strikes, and confrontations with Israeli soldiers. They threw stones. Israel responded with rubber bullets, live fire, arrests, demolitions. The images broadcast globally were stark. Young boys with slingshots facing down armored jeeps, mothers weeping as sons were dragged from homes in the middle of the night. For many in the West, this was the first time the Palestinian narrative reached their screens unfiltered. It was no longer just about terrorism or war, it was about occupation, dignity, and despair. The First Intifada changed everything. It made it clear that the status quo was not sustainable. not for Israel and not for the Palestinians. And so, for the first time, meaningful negotiations began. In 1993, under the cloak of secrecy in Norway, Israeli and Palestinian leaders met and crafted what would become known as the Oslo Accords. The world watched as Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn, with President Bill Clinton smiling behind them. It was a moment soaked in symbolism, two enemies acknowledging each other and committing to peace. The Oslo Accords were ambitious, a roadmap for two states, with Israel gradually withdrawing from occupied territories and Palestinians building the foundations of self-rule. The Palestinian Authority was created to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza. In exchange, Palestinians would recognize Israel's right to exist and renounce violence. But Oslo was flawed from the start. It left the hardest issues unresolved: the status of Jerusalem, the fate of refugees, the borders of a future Palestinian state, and the settlements, which continued to grow even during the negotiations. Trust was fragile. Extremists on both sides worked to destroy the process. In 1994, a Jewish extremist massacred 29 Palestinians in Hebron. In retaliation, Hamas, a rising Islamist group born during the First Intifada, launched suicide bombings in Israeli cities. The violence shattered public support. Then in 1995, everything unraveled. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, not by a Palestinian, but by an Israeli extremist who believed he was betraying the Jewish people. It was a turning point. The momentum of Oslo died with Rabin. The subsequent Israeli governments hardened their stance. And on the Palestinian side, hope turned into skepticism, then fury. The Second Intifada exploded in 2000, triggered by a visit to the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, by Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon. What began as protests quickly spiraled into chaos. Suicide bombings, tank invasions, targeted assassinations, helicopter strikes, curfews, checkpoints. The violence was on a scale not seen in years. Over 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis died. The peace process, already gasping, collapsed entirely. Israel responded by building a separation barrier, a wall, part concrete, part fence, that snaked through the West Bank. Officially, it was to protect against terror attacks. In reality, it also annexed parts of Palestinian land and further divided communities. The Israeli presence in the West Bank became entrenched, with over 100 settlements and hundreds of thousands of settlers by the mid-2000s. In Gaza, things took a different turn. In 2005, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, a hardliner turned pragmatist, withdrew Israeli troops and settlers from Gaza. The move was unilateral. There was no negotiation with the Palestinian leadership. Some hailed it as a step toward peace. Others saw it as a tactical move to solidify Israeli control over the West Bank and avoid a two-state solution. The vacuum in Gaza was quickly filled by Hamas. In 2006, they won the Palestinian legislative elections, shocking the international community. A year later, after a brief and bloody power struggle, Hamas took full control of Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority remained in charge of the West Bank. This division has defined Palestinian politics ever since. Two governments, two ideologies, two fractured halves of a broken dream. The world reacted swiftly. The United States, Israel, and the EU labeled Hamas a terrorist organization and imposed a blockade on Gaza. Israel sealed its borders. Egypt, fearing Islamist spillover, did the same. Gaza became a cage. 2 million people trapped in a narrow strip of land, with limited electricity, crumbling infrastructure, and no path to freedom. From 2008 onward, war became cyclical. Israel would strike Gaza after rockets were fired. Hamas would fire rockets in retaliation for Israeli raids or killings. Thousands died. Schools were bombed. Hospitals overwhelmed. Civilians on both sides lived under the shadow of war. International attempts at peace faltered repeatedly. Ceasefires held briefly, then collapsed. The core issues, occupation, refugees, settlements, borders, remained untouched. And yet, through all of this, the question remained unanswered. Who owns the land? Who has the right to return? Who counts as human when the bombs fall? Because at the heart of this conflict, beyond religion, beyond politics, beyond borders, is something elemental. It's the story of two peoples, each with a wound, each with a narrative they believe is true. For Israelis, the state is a miracle of survival after the horror of the Holocaust, a refuge in a world that has always turned its back. For Palestinians, It is a story of dispossession, of exile, of olive groves lost, and sons buried without justice. And while peace plans have come and gone, while borders have shifted and leaders have died, that core wound has never closed. Because neither side feels safe. Because neither side feels heard. And because the world, with its selective attention and strategic alliances, has too often fueled the flames instead of dousing them. But we're not done yet. There's one more part to tell. The part that leads us to now. To the rockets. To the protests. To the millions watching, screaming, praying for something to change. To the question that still haunts the region. Will this ever end? Here is Part 3. The final chapter of your long-form documentary. Why are Israel and Palestine still at war? The conflict 100 years in the making, Part 3. It is the present now. But the present in this part of the world does not feel new. It feels like a loop. Sirens in Tel Aviv, smoke rising from Gaza, funerals with flags draped over bodies, and children, always children, learning fear before they ever learn peace. The war has never ended. It only pauses, changes shape, waits, and then returns. In October 2023, that cycle shattered expectations. What happened shocked even those long inured to tragedy. Hamas launched a coordinated, large-scale attack on southern Israel, breaking through the fence that had hemmed in Gaza for over a decade. Thousands of rockets were fired. Fighters stormed Israeli towns, killing civilians, taking hostages. It was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. The horror was visceral, raw, and immediate. For many Israelis, the sense of invincibility, built carefully over decades of military dominance and technological supremacy, vanished in hours. But what followed was no less devastating. Israel declared war. Airstrikes rained down on Gaza. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. Hospitals, schools, refugee camps, all were struck. The official targets were Hamas command centers and tunnel networks, but the civilian death toll was staggering. Water, electricity, and humanitarian aid were cut off. Gaza, already described by human rights groups as an open-air prison, became a killing field. International condemnation was immediate and divided. Some nations backed Israel's right to defend itself, citing the unprecedented nature of the Hamas attack. Others condemned the siege and the disproportionate response. But the deeper story was harder to tell. Because this wasn't just about one attack or one retaliation. It was the eruption of something buried, unresolved, and constantly inflamed by global hypocrisy. The United States, Israel's staunchest ally, reaffirmed its support. Billions in aid continued to flow. European nations walked a tightrope, calling for de-escalation while maintaining ties with both sides. Arab nations, many of whom had begun normalizing relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords, found themselves under pressure from their own people, who watched the destruction of Gaza in real time on social media. And amid it all, the Palestinians, the majority of whom had no say in Hamas actions and no protection from Israel's, paid the highest price. Over half of Gaza's population was displaced. Entire families wiped out in a single night. Journalists killed. Doctors working under bombardment. Children orphaned. Again. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, violence surged too. Israeli settlers, emboldened by the conflict, attacked Palestinian villages with increasing impunity. The Israeli army cracked down harder, arresting hundreds. The Palestinian Authority, weak and aging, offered little resistance, little leadership. And so the idea of a Palestinian state, already a distant dream, now seemed like a fantasy. What had once been a political struggle for land had become something else. A crisis of identity, of morality, of how far a people will go to survive and what the world will allow in the name of security. This is where we are now. But how did it come to this? How did the Oslo dreams turn to ashes? How did the hope of 1993 give way to the rubble of 2023? There is no single answer, only layers. A wall of complexity built on top of real people. One layer is the occupation, over half a century of military control over Palestinian lives. Generations born into checkpoints, surveillance, and a legal system that treats them as suspects first, citizens never. The settlements, illegal under international law, continue to expand. Each new home is a message. We are not leaving. Another layer is political paralysis. In Israel, the political system has shifted rightward for years. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, has governed with a mix of security promises and nationalist rhetoric. Under his leadership, peace talks have all but disappeared. In the Palestinian territories, Leadership is fractured and failing. Mahmoud Abbas, aging and unpopular, holds on to power in the West Bank, while Hamas rules Gaza through fear and control. Then there's the role of the international community, a story of double standards and missed chances. The West, which preaches human rights, turns a blind eye to occupation when it suits its allies. The Arab world, divided and self-interested, uses Palestinian suffering for political capital, but rarely offers concrete support. The United Nations passes resolutions, but they change nothing. The media, often caught between bias and fatigue, reduces complex histories into headlines, failing to tell the full truth. But perhaps the deepest layer is psychological. Both sides carry trauma, deep generational trauma. For Israelis, the Holocaust is not history, it's a living wound. The fear of annihilation is real, even if Israel today is a nuclear-armed regional power. For Palestinians, the Nakba is not the past, it is their present. The refugee camps, the bulldozed homes, the daily humiliations, these are not memories. They are the fabric of life. This trauma feeds mistrust. Mistrust feeds violence. And violence feeds the cycle. Every act of aggression justifies the next. Every death becomes a number in a ledger no one ever closes. And every child born inherits the conflict, not by choice, but by geography. And yet, amid the rubble, there are voices. Voices that refuse to be silenced. Israeli and Palestinian activists who march side by side. Families of victims who demand peace, not revenge. Artists, teachers, doctors who choose hope over hatred, even when the cost is high. They are few, but they are there. And they remind us that history is not destiny. Because this war, this unending war, is not inevitable. It is constructed, maintained, funded, justified. But anything constructed can be dismantled. Peace is not a gift. It is not something bestowed by leaders or delivered by treaties. It is built, slowly, painfully, by people. By mothers who teach their sons not to hate. By soldiers who refuse to shoot. By refugees who hold keys not as weapons, but as symbols of return. By citizens who say, enough. And so we end, not with an answer, because there is no easy answer. Not with a promise, because promises here are fragile things. But with a challenge, to the world, to ourselves, to anyone still watching, to tell the full story. To look beyond the headlines. To see the people, the grief, the stubborn hope. And to ask not just why Israel and Palestine are still at war, but what we are doing to help it end.